Paris Accord was somewhere between a farce and a fraud.
But when President Trump took office, he said,
"The United States will withdraw."
What? We will withdraw? We alone?
President Trump isolated the United States with his reckless and indefensible decision.
My neighbors in New York agree with that. And so do most of the media.
A lot at stake, potentially for the planet.
Really? I bet they don't even know what was in the agreement. I didn't.
Paris Accord was somewhere between a farce and a fraud.
When President Trump took office, he said,
"The United States will withdraw."
What? We will withdraw?
If you're president, the first thing you do the first day is you rejoin the Paris Agreement. This is just ridiculous for us to drop out.
Today's a historic day in the fight to protect our planet for future generations. 10 months ago in Paris, I said before the world that we needed a strong global agreement to reduce carbon pollution and to set the world on a low carbon course.
You're always reading about carbon and reducing carbon emissions. They use the word carbon when in fact they're talking about carbon dioxide. But if they used carbon dioxide, people would realize, well, that's the odorless, colorless gas that we all exhale. It's the gas that keeps vegetation alive. And so that doesn't conjure up any negative thoughts. But
plants are made of carbon. You know, when I hear about carbon pollution, you know, we're all made of carbon. Plants are made of carbon. People made of carbon. You know, your hamburger's made of carbon.
To reduce carbon pollution and to set the world on a low carbon course. To reduce carbon pollution and to set the world on a low carbon course. The result was the Paris Agreement. The result was the Paris Agreement. Last month, the United States and China, the world's two largest economies and largest emitters, formally joined that agreement together.
Paris Accord was somewhere between a farce and a fraud.
Manhattan Institute senior fellow Oren is one of the few people who've actually read the Paris Agreement and also the commitment set in by every country.
You don't even have to mention greenhouse gases in your commitment if you don't want to. You send in any piece of paper you want. We're going to staple them all together, and we're going to call that the Paris Accord. Everyone sent in a piece of paper, and they stapled it together and held it up and said, this is amazing.
China has made a major commitment.
So what's in the commitments that every country made?
India has ratified the Paris Climate Accord, committing the world's fastest growing economy to limit carbon dioxide emissions.
What you find is they either pledged to do exactly what they were already going to do anyway, or pledged even less than that. China, for instance, said, we pledge to reach peak emissions by about 2030. Well, the United States government had already done a study to guess when Chinese emissions would peak, and their guess was about 2030.
Peak doesn't mean stop, it just means stop increasing.
That's right. So in fact, China promised they will continue increasing their emissions for some time to come.
And yet,
China was actually one of the better pledges. India made no pledge to limit their emissions at all. They pledged only to become more efficient, but they proposed to become efficient less quickly than they're already becoming more efficient. So their pledge was to slow down. You know, my favorite was Pakistan, whose pledge was to reach a peak at some point, after which to begin reducing emissions. And so you can staple those together and you can say we now have a global agreement, but what you have is an agreement to do nothing. And if anything, you've gone backwards, because whereas in the past you could have criticized countries and said, hey, why aren't you doing anything? Now we have an agreement that says, in fact, we will applaud you for doing nothing.
We came together around the strong agreement the world needed.
Obviously, President Obama got a lot of political mileage out of that, but the climate didn't get much at all. The one country that showed up in Paris with a very costly, ambitious target was the United States. So President Obama took all the zero commitments from everybody else, but threw in a really expensive one for us.
Super expensive. Obama pledged to reduce American emissions by a quarter.
One of the hottest years on record. It was among the hottest years recorded.
The hottest year on record.
Another hot year. Global warming. What will we do about that? Politicians from most every country promised to deal with it by signing something called the Paris Climate Agreement.
Developing, including China and India, they're not required to reduce anything.
And as you mentioned, what the Paris Agreement does is it saddles the Western democracies, and especially the United States, with restrictions on carbon dioxide emissions, with restrictions on energy usage, with restrictions on affordable energy that do not apply to the rest of the world and will never apply to the rest of the world. Why wouldn't every other nation in the world sign on to the Paris Agreement?
There's an upcoming $27 trillion market worldwide for green. There's an upcoming $27 trillion market worldwide for green.
Administrator of the EPA, she was testifying before congressional hearings about the Clean Power Plan, and she was asked about the impact on actual temperatures. And of course, she danced around the question quite a lot, basically said, well, it's to lead the world. And the reason, it's interesting, the Institute for Energy Research, they speculated after her 2014 hearing, they said the likely reason McCarthy is reticent to discuss the actual effect on climate is because the impact is very small. It turns out if you use the EPA's magic model, the impact of this rule would reduce the rise in global temperatures by 0.137 degrees by 2100. So in Canada, it's even worse. They're talking about a carbon tax that's going to suck $10 billion out of the economy by around 2025. And Pat Michaels did a calculation to figure out what would that do to the world temperature. And again, according to the EPA's model, it was between 1 and 2 1/1000ths of a degree by 2100 at a cost of over $10 billion in 1 year.
As James brought up the Paris Accord and the fact that President Obama actually contributed $500 million to the Green Action Fund, which is a primary part of the Paris Accord. I've got a few very shocking things to tell the audience about the Paris Accord, which has been talked about constantly in Governor Brown's summit. Their real goal is to get our country back into the Paris Accord. That is absolutely not going to happen. But if we were to sign on to the Accord, it says 4 or 5 very important things. One is that every country that signs on to the Accord can sue the United States if they can show that our carbon dioxide emissions float over their nations. The Accord also says that any technology that we may develop to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, we must give away freely to every country that is signed on to the Accord. It also says that any new technology that we develop in the United States, we must be able to prove that it does not add significant amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And finally, basically, the United States is named as the primary supplier of money to the fund, and that amount was $3 trillion. President Obama, in the last administration, already contributed $500 million. President Trump has said he will not contribute another penny. And the best news of all, just 10 days ago, the president named a man who will be the primary science advisor within the White House. His name is William Happer. He's a professor emeritus of physics at Princeton University. He agrees with all of us on this panel, everything we've said about global warming alarmism, and he's one of the world's leading experts on carbon dioxide. He's right now writing a book about the wonders of carbon dioxide. Everything that people blame carbon dioxide on the negative side is absolutely reversed. It is why we live on this planet, and in fact, the more we pump into the atmosphere, the better life on Earth will be.
But when President Trump took office, he said,
The United States will withdraw.
What? We will withdraw? We alone?
President Trump isolated the United States with his reckless and indefensible decision.
My neighbors in New York agree with that. And so do most of the media.
A lot at stake, potentially for the planet.
Really? I bet they don't even know what was in the agreement. I didn't.
Paris Accord was somewhere between a farce and a fraud.
The scientists are telling us that if we don't act incredibly boldly within the next 6-7 years, there will be irreparable damage done, not just to Nevada, not just to Vermont or Massachusetts, but to the entire world. Joe said it right. This is an existential threat. You know what that means, Chuck? That means we're fighting for the future of this planet and the Green New Deal that I support.
There's an upcoming $27 trillion market worldwide for green.
One, get back into that international climate change agreement.
On day one, when I'm elected president, I'm going to invite all of the members of the Paris Accord to Washington, D.C.